Hey, powerful creators, and welcome to this month's episode of Crucial Conversations. Gentle reminder, Inner Sense Healing Arts Collective is a nonprofit where we are focused on fostering self-reflective practices within disempowered populations in an effort to build a restored and engaged community. Our vision is to create a horizontal system of support which understands the shared responsibility of community in creating a more embodied and peaceful society. I'm really excited. I'm your host, Janita Wiley. My name has changed, but that's a story for another day. We have a very, very special guest. Adrienne Maree Brown is the writer in residence at the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute. She is the author of We Will Not Cancel Us, which I have, and other dreams of transformative justice, pleasure activism, the politics of feeling good, Emergent Strategy, which has inspired this whole entire conversation, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co-creator of Octavia Brood's science fiction from social justice movements and how to get stupid white men, sorry, that was kind of funny, out of office. She is the host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Pablo's podcast. Adrienne Maree Brown is rooted in Detroit, and Adrienne Maree Brown is rooted in this work and is here today. Please welcome our guest, Adrienne Maree Brown.
Hi.
Hi.
How's it going?
It's going great. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for the intro.
Yeah, no, I mean, the titles of your books are amazing. You are amazing. And we are all really excited to have you here. We will take questions live throughout this conversation, and we'll be talking about both of your books, Emergent Strategy and We Will Not Cancel Us. So real quick, though, let's talk about how we got here. So I'm on the board of Isha, and I was introduced to your work by them. And so board, and they're like, we're doing an Emergent Strategy. I'm like, huh? We're already doing it. I have no idea what Emergent Strategy is. I have no idea what they're talking about. But they have us go get your book. So I got your book and we started reading it, and we've been implementing strategies at Isha, finding out that Isha has already been in an Emergent Strategy group. And then one day I was like, hey, what if we just reached out and asked Adrienne?
Had a conversation.
Yeah. And everyone's like, no, I don't know. She's busy. We don't know. I'm like, hey, the worst that's going to happen is we're not going to get a response, or we're going to get a no.
Yeah, exactly. You never know until you ask.
Well, yeah. So we just want to thank you because obviously you've said yes, and everyone in our community is really excited to have you here. And so with that being said, let's just get into the crucial conversation. In both your books, you start off with talking about who you are. Can you tell us who you are?
Yeah.
I mean, I know the intro, but more because you use really specific language.
Yeah, no, well, I think it's like identity is such an interesting thing. And I feel like I never want to make an assumption that anyone is reading my text like, I know who she is, but I'm like, who I am actually really informs my text, right? So I am a Black biracial person, woman, queer, fat, femme. I have arthritis. I'm a Virgo, and I have been facilitating and mediating inside of social justice movements for the last, I think it's 23 years. I keep trying to do the math and be like, how long exactly, is the first time that I was doing the work in some formal way. There's preschool happening upstairs, so you might hear the sounds of like children's feet and children's
Right.
screaming joy. So yeah, my father was in the Army for 30 years. My parents are a big love story. Like they fell in love. It was a very romantic situation. And I grew up inside that condition of like a deep romantic love between these two Southerners, Black and white, who traveled the world. And I've been an organizer of social justice, like someone who thinks of myself as a movement person since I was in college. You know, I started to recognize while I was in college, I was like, everything in this world is a lie, and everything in this world needs to change, and everything in this world can change. And we are part of that change. I'm also an Octavia Butler scholar. So I love reading and looking at what thinkers before me have done and finding my way into the river of thought that they have traversed. So those are some things about me.
Well, thank you. Identity politics are so interesting. Part of me has hesitated with explaining your identity, particularly around being fat and a witch, because it feels wrong for me to say that. So it does, you know, it's like, I understand that Adrienne identifies as this. This is her identity.
Yes.
Writes it out, but it feels harmful for me to say it.
Yeah. I mean, what it speaks to is socialization, right? The ways that we are socialized and the ways we're socialized to use language to cause harm or against each other or to bring each other down in some way. And some of the language, you know, I don't know if it can be reclaimed. Some language, I feel like it depends how you feel inside of it, right? And so there's certain things in my life that I've looked at and been like, oh, like I do believe that I can partner with the elements of nature to shift the energy that's happening and shift the way things are moving. And I've seen it work very well. So in that regard, I identify as a witch. But I definitely grew up like in a Christian context where it's like witches are bad and Jesus is good. And it's like, you know, there's definitely another context in which Jesus could definitely be seen as a witch, you know, just like someone who like worked with water and worked with nature and worked with the elements and created change. But it also really, you know, depends on your relationship to God. And I think that for me, the realm of nature is the realm of the divine. It's the realm of the creative. And we are all nature. We are all part of the divine. And some might call that a child of God. You know, I call it a witch. So, and fatness is so interesting, especially for small people. You know, it's like, how do I orient around this? And like, how do I make sure, you know, I think a lot of it is examining within ourselves. Like, how am I orienting towards this? Like, am I orienting to this as something that is bad? Where did I learn that it was bad? How would I feel? You know, a lot of times I talk with people who are smaller. I'm like, how would you feel if you ended up fat? And like, process that, because at some point you might, you know, these bodies are constantly changing, and how we are in one moment is not our forever life. But I'm also an anti-capitalist, which I didn't mention, I don't think, in that first intro. But part of the reason I'm an anti-capitalist is because I believe capitalism is one of the main forces that is constantly trying to get us to think of ourselves in these categories that are hierarchical and categories in which we constantly need to be fixing and changing something about ourselves. And I think one of the most anti-capitalist things I can do is just claim my whole self lovingly. So that's one of the activities I'm often up to.
In being an anti-capitalist, is there an inherent contradiction? Because also you have to live in the world, right? Like you have to work for yourself.
Exactly. So, you know, I think a lot of times people think that anti-capitalist means you are anti-money or anti-resource or anti-exchange of goods or something. And for me, I'm thinking about capitalism as this sense of constant growth and constant scarcity and a constant expanding gaping hole between those who have resources and are able to accumulate resources and those who aren't. Since the beginning of time, people have bartered and exchanged goods and services. And there's cooperative ways of doing that. There's collaborative ways of doing that. Capitalism says the only way we can do that is to compete with each other. So when I write a book, for instance, if I put my book out, I'm not trying to price it so that I can compete with other people. I'm not thinking of my text as competing with other Black feminists or other organizers or other writers I respect. I'm seeing myself as putting something in that I hope weaves together with those works. And in every work that I produce, I'm trying to uplift other people's work and be like, let's be in a collaborative development of fields of knowledge and fields of practice with each other. And, it's one of the reasons why I publish with AK Press as opposed to other presses, because AK is a community-oriented anarchist. There are a business that really aligns with the ways that I think of the world. They're also none of us, we're never promoting or pushing our work. It's really about like, can we create a space where we can put these big ideas onto a page and share them in our community?
Okay, so what I'm also hearing is that you're really intentional with where you go and show up in the world and who you work with.
Yeah.
And do your research.
Yeah, always. I mean, I think one of the things that happens to us is we can get very seduced by ease and seduced by the narrative that people give of, oh, we're good, and this is one of the things that's been so interesting to watch with, for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement, that as the Black Lives Matter movement has become this compelling force that's shaping and changing everything, now all these brands are like, oh yeah, Black Lives Matter, and want to do like the surface level of engagement of what that means. And I think one of the things that's always interesting is, how do you dig under the surface and say, do Black lives actually matter in your organization? Do Black lives actually matter in your budget? Do Black lives actually matter in your policies? Do Black lives actually matter in the power structures and who holds power in your organization or your relationships or your life? I'm always paying attention to and I think of it as, what is the practice? And it's immense for me because I'm a word person. So I'm always talking, I'm always thinking, I'm always writing. And I think a lot can happen in the realm of words, but actions speak even louder than words. And I think of direct action. I was with the Ruckus Society for 5 years, which trains people in nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience. And that was our motto. It was like, what are you actually up to? What are you practicing? In somatic realm, we talk about what you practice is what you are. So I'm like, it doesn't matter if you're saying something, but what you're doing is completely at odds with that. I'm really, really intrigued by, where are the places where you're in integrity, where what you say and what you do align. If you speak about radical ideas, how are you practicing?
Oh, wow. That's so deep. Well, let's explore that, thinking about being in alignment with our actions and being integrity.
Okay.
Justice, performative allyship, right? So you talked about using Black Lives Matter movement as an example, organizations using that, but behind the scenes, they're not really supporting Black lives. Their structures are still inherently racist. Their budget and their funding and all that stuff doesn't trickle down. But is it really bad though? If we're thinking about it, on the outside, we're saying that Black people matter.
Yeah.
And
to me, it's not a good bad, right? And most of the things, you'll get this from me probably a lot, is most of the time I'm not going to be oriented towards good, bad, but I'm oriented towards what is the complexity that is at foot, and then how can we start to shift and shape the complexity towards something that actually results in the kind of world that we want. And I'm always thinking what is the vision that I hold? What is the vision that we're involved in? And how are we moving towards that vision? So if we want a world in which Black Lives Matter, it's wonderful if, for instance, the National Basketball League or Association or whatever, NBA, if everyone in the NBA is wearing shirts to talk about Black Lives Matter, right? That's great. That's a beautiful step in the right direction. And then using that step, right? We want to say, and now we also want to harness this and make sure that resources, the kind of immense resources the NBA can galvanize, are actually applied to the needs of Black communities, because most of these teams are rooted inside of cities where there are huge Black and brown communities that are being impacted by the police, that are being impacted by disparate health policies, that are being impacted by disparate economic policies. So, for me, it's it's always, I'm like, okay, great, we made this step. How do we keep going into the next step? And I think one of the things we have to always be careful of, if I was going to say something that was bad, is when people take the first step and think, good, that's enough. I said it and that's enough. I don't have to actually change my practices or my behaviors. And I actually think the current this current political moment that we're in speaks to this in a major way. That there were a lot of people who were like, hey, we have a Black president. That's enough. That's fine. But nothing actually changed in people's minds and hearts and spirits around how they viewed Black people. So we end up with 45, right? We end up with this really traumatizing experience of having white supremacy take over, take leadership, take the center of everything. We always know it's there under the surface, but when it comes out to the forefront, that's in response to this kind of nice, polite agreeing with the language of post-racialism, but not actually being in any kind of practices that speak to addressing racism, right?
Wow.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I'm understanding that it's nuanced. We're really talking about something that's not just black or white, right or wrong. There's gray, there's duality in it. It's even interesting when you said, for instance, that we had a Black president. My mind instantly went to, well, not technically yes, technically no, because
we had a biracial president, right?
Yes, like his father's from Kenya. He's biracial, and so already I saw that in the ways that kind of limits who he actually was, and it also doesn't really encompass who even is Black in America, you know.
Or it's one Black story, right? Because we have tons and tons of people who live here who are recent immigrants or more recent immigrants, and whose parents were not descendants of people who actually experienced American slavery, right?
Yeah.
Like, I think that's one of the distinctions we're taking, which doesn't mean they're also not Black people experiencing Black life in the country right now. And I think as we start to tease these things apart, to me, it gets really fascinating. Who is allowed to take leadership in the country? Like, you know, whose leadership is acceptable, and what relationship to trauma does to how far people can go in terms of leadership in this country right now.
Wow.
I do think it's really interesting that people who have that enslaved Black experience have not made it to the vice presidency or the presidency.
No, I think it's a different mindset, you know, because when I think about my experiences of going through K through 12, I remember learning, hey, you were a slave, and then your people fought for justice. That's a total different mindset, right? You're a minority, you're this. So growing up in a K through 12 school, I'm learning that I'm insignificant. I had to beg white people to let me be human. I would say other Black individuals from other countries don't have that experience. Their first ideologies or their first teachings of self is not that, you know, you were enslaved and you didn't have a right to breathe without permission.
Well, I mean, I would argue with you, I think, on that, because I think the issue is we don't know what most of those experiences are, right? So if someone is a first or second generation Black person, you know, if their family came here one generation ago or they're new, they're still treated. It's not like white people look at them and they're like, I can tell.
That's true.
When your ancestors arrived here. It's not like they're like, oh, you know what? We're not going to be racist to you because you guys just got here one generation ago. No. So I think one of the things is, if you have Black or brown skin in this country, the way white supremacy works is it just clusters it all together. And I think one of the things we have to be so careful about is not to then keep up that same practice of clustering, right? That we don't know, you know, maybe someone doesn't say, I came from the experience of American slavery, but that doesn't mean they weren't like a child enslaved warrior somewhere else, right? Like, there's so many varieties of experiences that people have gone through. And white supremacy is a global pandemic in and of itself, right? Capitalism is a global pandemic. And, you know, I think one of the things that for me has been really helpful is to say, how do I take off what capitalism is training me to do all the time, is compare and create these hierarchies of either getting ahead or oppression Olympics, right? Hierarchies of hardship and being like, oh, we had it worse. I'm like, we all have it bad in different ways, as long as white supremacy is allowed to lead. And I really think for me, part of what emergent strategy is practicing is like, how do we get into a common practice of resilience in the face of these overwhelming and seemingly ubiquitous strategies, right? It feels like the water we're swimming in is white supremacy, and it makes us constantly be critiquing each other. And I think our resilience is in remembering we all also have a lineage that takes us back before white supremacy, before we ever came in contact with this idea of inferiority in any way, before we ever came in contact with this idea that we had to compete for basic needs to be met. Most of us have some indigenous lineage, if we go back far enough, where people were working in more cooperative ways. And so it's like, how do we learn from that, but bring it into this now multicultural, multidimensional, multiracial present? And I don't think we're anywhere close to having figured out like how we do that. I think we've still got a long way to go. And I think it happens in these kind of conversations. Like, I'm like, what is your experience of Blackness? What is my experience of Blackness? I think it's actually important that one of the 3 founders of Black Lives Matter, Opal, is the whole work that she does is with Black immigrants, right? Folks who are like, we're here, and what are the experiences of racism, vice versa, that we're having? And how do we weave all that together so that we build a global analysis, and so that we can't be tricked on any front line?
Yeah. For those of our viewers who may not understand what emergent strategy is, what is it?
Okay. I'm always changing like what it is, but I think the main way that I would describe it at this moment is it's about how do we get in right relationship with change? How do we get in right relationship with change? And it's rooted in, there's this concept, scientific concept called emergence, which is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of relatively simple interactions. An example I often give is if you see a massive murmuration of birds, when you see birds moving all together and seeming to be one massive body, it looks super complex. Like, how would you choreograph such a thing? But it's actually, each bird is only paying attention to like the 5 to 7 birds right around it. And it's very subtle, simple motions that they're making to avoid predation. And I think one of the ways it started in me was like, what would it look like if movements for social change could murmurate like that, could move like a murmuration of birds? How would we have to change the way we think and be in order to be in that kind of relationship with each other? And it's also in the lineage of Octavia Butler's work, particularly the earthseed offerings that she made in the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents. One of the things she offered us is all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. And so it's like the idea is that if change is the most divine and constant thing that's happening throughout our entire lives, how do we partner with it instead of becoming victims to it? So that's kind of the broad strokes. There's a lot about interdependence in there. There's a lot about transformative justice, resilience, how to be generative, and creating more possibilities.
Well, also, to all of our powerful creators, remember, you can ask questions live. We'll take them.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we're talking about being generative. In what ways, how does that even work, right? Because I'm thinking like, sometimes life doesn't feel like it's changing.
Yes.
Everything is changing.
Yeah, I mean, I love that, right? Sometimes it feels very stagnant. I think for a lot of people, this past 11 months are we in now of being in the pandemic and being like, I have to stay in one place. I can't go. Like, for me, I have spent years of my life where I was only home 2 or 3 days of a month. And then the rest of the time I was in transit, Yeah. And so there could definitely be a way that I could feel very stagnant or like nothing is changing. And one of the ways that I have made this time generative is to say, how do I actually harness this stillness for my writing life? How do I actually harness this stillness for my spiritual well-being? How do I harness this stillness for my body? So I'm now the one who's creating more of the changes inside of the container. But in movement space, a lot of how we get generative is by moving ourselves into a place of being solution-oriented together. What does it look like to be developing a shared analysis and then collectively creating solutions that work for more of us? And so many of the ways, I talk about, and I quote my friend Terry Marshall, who said to me, we're in an imagination battle, right? That it's basically like we live inside of a world that someone else imagined for us that actually didn't have a lot of possibilities for us, right? As Black people, as women, it's like you have a very specific role. You're supposed to be in domestic servitude to whiteness, to wealth. And if you are out of line, or if you try to operate your freedom in any way, can kill you in the streets. And, we look at Mike Brown, we look at Trayvon, we look at all these young people who have been killed by the police. And the defense is that they were imagined to be scary. They were imagined to be harmful. They were imagined to be armed. So the imagination can be extremely powerful. Yeah. And if we are going to create a new world, part of being generative is saying we are going to generate an imagination and a vision that takes us beyond this scenario, a vision that actually includes all of our various needs and ways of being and our equality. I think for me, imagination has led me to understand that I'm not lesser than anybody, not on a default, right? And it's actually quite delicious to come in contact now with people who think that they're better than me, because I'm like, oh, you're living in an old imagination, but I'm living in a new one that's just as valid. And I'm actually always inviting people. I'm like, you don't have to come into my imagination lesser than me, but you're definitely not going to come in better than me, right? We're going to be on par. We're going to create a world together. So generative, right? I'm generating a space in which I can exist and no one can take that from me.
Well, it's interesting because while it's another person's imagination, there's a reality and a physical sometimes consequence.
Exactly. That's what many, many thinkers have said, that we, in order to build the world, we first imagine it. So we imagine it, and then it becomes something that feels so real. Right now we live inside these constructs that we literally, it's like a struggle to imagine that men and women is just a construct, right? And so when we see people like, maybe I was born this way, but I actually know myself to be a different way, we're like, what? It's like, but that's real. So the imagination of this binary construct falls apart under the pressure of reality. I think race happens the same way. When people are like, all Black people are like this, but then you meet, that quirky Black person who's like, no, I like kicking hacky sacks or whatever it is. And you're just like,
you're so different. You're a different type.
You're like, what? It's like, no, because actually the race as it was handed down to us is the construct. And our Blackness, the Blackness that I like to claim, is everything we have done to survive and to hold on to our humanity in spite of that construct. But I don't for 1 minute believe that there's anything that's uniquely inferior about me because someone white imagined that Black people were inferior to white people. And when you start to interrogate and pull it apart, then it's just like, oh, this is a construct. It's your imagined construct, and you have built a fort out of it. You have built policies out of it. You have built nations out of it. That still doesn't make it a permanent force in reality, right? It's not stardust. It's not going to last forever. So I always like to think, how do we turn it in? If you've ever seen that geological thing where you like the Grand Canyon, you can see all the different layers of the past. I like to think that white supremacy and capitalism will just be those thin layers in those lines, and that we will continue creating new societal structures on top of that, so that someday we'll barely recognize that this period that we're now surviving with everything we've got, this is also temporary. It's a construct, and we're going to imagine our way out of it.
As I'm listening to you, I'm also kind of in some ways triggered a little bit because I had a situation within a year where I was in a lift, and my driver was a white woman. She made a turn. She goes in the wrong direction. I say, oh, I'm going to be late. That's all I said. Oh, I'm going to be late. She's like hyperventilating, telling me that she feels uncomfortable in the car and that she feels threatened. And the whole entire time I keep thinking, like, what am I doing?
What's going to happen to me? Yeah.
No, not what's going to happen to me. Am I aggressive right now?
Wow. She made you question yourself.
Yeah, because I'm thinking like I'm pretty calm, but I also know I have a lot of energy. Like even when you came out, I was like, oh, hey, how are you? I'm super excited. She's imagining that I'm a threat, because if we just were to look at stature, I probably cannot pick her.
That's right.
But I'm gonna go down fighting if I have to. But
but like that's one of the things about the racist imagination. Like Blackness adds 100 pounds and 20 feet, right? Yeah. It's like it's so fascinating to look at how many times in descriptions when people talk about Black children that they were scared of and they had to shoot. And then the descriptions over and over again, it's like they appeared taller, they appeared more aggressive, even that other witnesses are like, their back was turned and they're like, no, they were facing me and they were coming at me. It's like, wow, like it, in any other context, we'd be like, okay, some distortion is happening in your mind that is so different from reality that we need to give you some mental health support. And I remember years ago hearing a Chris Rock special where he talked about that, like that whiteness, the way that whiteness plays out is a mental health issue. And I'm not sure, he said it a little bit more like comedic, but I think about that often, that I'm like, well, you know, how do we turn and face that there is this rampant issue that has taken so many people in this country, and it is in the foundations of the soil of this country, and whose work is it to help people see that it's there and to unveil it? And I would argue it's not Black people's job to do that. You know, I feel like our job is to exist and to reclaim our right to exist and reclaim our humanity, reclaim our equality. And I'm always trying to uplift projects where white people are taking on the responsibility that I believe is theirs. So the Catalyst Project is an incredible institute that trains people. They have the Ann Braden Institute, where it actually like sends white people through like an 18-month project of learning about when did whiteness come to exist? How has it operated? Where do I fit into that? How does it play out economically? And then they get the chance to actually be under the leadership of Black and brown people. So they have to actually learn what that feels like, because it's a whole somatic rearrangement that a lot of white folks are like, even if they want to, you know, and I see that earnest whiteness of like, I want to follow Black leadership. The earnestness does not mean that you know how to do it. And we are lucky right now because there's more resources than there have ever been before for white people, for men, for straight people, for able-bodied people, on how to unlearn and decolonize your supremacy. But that's the main thing. I tell people all the time is like, just be in relationship and examine yourself. Sorry, my little turtle is coming over here. You want to come over here now?
Oh, bring the turtle. Let the turtle come say hi. We actually also have questions too. So
oh, good.
We have a really engaged audience.
Come here, baby.
One is from Julie. Julie wants to know, what is the line of engagement with those who are in a different paradigm imagination? When do we walk away and know they are choosing not to heal or face the truth? Ooh, that's powerful.
That's a great question. Turtle, when do we know if we should walk away from people? When should we walk away from them? I know, it's a big deal. You know, for me, my main guideline on like walking away or staying in with people is if I feel like I could actually survive and be myself and be healthy and safe in the engagement. And there's been times where I've been like, I'm the facilitator, I'm in front of the room, and I still don't feel safe. I still feel like, you know, the paradigm that's in the room is more dominant, and it doesn't actually want to hear, it doesn't actually want to heal. And this is one of the things I think is so duplicitous about how whiteness can work sometimes, is it's like wants to be seen as doing the right thing without actually having to practice doing the right thing. And that can create a very dangerous paradigm, because then perception becomes more powerful than the reality that's happening in this space. I do think there are a ton of Black and brown and queer and trans and indigenous people who are like, part of my calling is to help people learn to love and to help forgive and to help move in those directions. For me, I'm like, is justice able to be present in this room? Is justice able to be present in this room? And when I think of justice, I'm like, that means I'm in a space where neither of us is making assumptions about the other person. We're able to have an honest conversation. The next book I have coming out is called Holding Change. And it's the way of emergent strategy, facilitation, and mediation. It really digs into this. There's a piece called An Invitation to Brave Space by Mickey Scott Bay Jones. And I'm like, if you're in a space that can be brave, which is different from the idea of safe, because I'm like, I don't know if we can promise each other safe spaces right now, because we're all carrying all the constructs and the harmful patterns and the socialized competition. We're carrying that around in us all the time.
Sometimes you don't know where I'm safe.
Exactly, right? And like sometimes we're not safe unto ourselves. We don't even know how to like be honest enough to keep ourselves safe. But the idea of brave space is to show it fully, knowing that we're going to make mistakes, knowing that we are going to cross each other's boundaries, and knowing that we will do the work to repair and to move forward from that. And, you know, I think you have to practice that very intimately. I think if you find yourself in spaces where the only available move feels like yelling down people and having to combat and constantly defend your existence, that's when that's when it's like, that's no longer, I don't think that's what, the universe intends for us. I do think there's a way that we have to be willing to set stuff down. And I include in that family members, community members, folks who continue to try to pull us back into regressive ways of being with each other.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like that causes a lot of grief. We're constantly having to defend ourselves, which actually leads into our next question from Aaliyah, who wants to know what you have to say about living in a new imagination as while processing collective and personal grief.
Yes. I mean, one of my great teachers on this is my friend Malkia Devich Cyril, who I think just posted that she's lost 14 close people in the last 10 years. So one of the things I think is so important is that we live in a world in which grief is not outside of ourselves or outside of any of the spaces that we create. To me, living in a new imagination is imagination that includes, we have an immense amount to grieve for all the time. And any world that we're in, if you just think of it as the climate, the earth, the species, it takes 40 years, 30 to 40 years for us to feel the impact of human behaviors, like all the carbon we emit, all the trash that we create, all the pollution we create. It takes 40 years for that to actually hit the planet. So right now, the climate changes we're seeing, those are from what was in the world 30 to 40 years ago, which is only multiplied 1,000-fold. So even if tomorrow we woke up and we're all like, we're going to be in the right relationship with the planet, we still have a ton of grief. There's going to be a lot of species loss. There's going to be a lot of additional weather crises that seem natural but are man-made. And I think part of being a human in this moment is actually learning, how do I make room for my grief as a part of the full range of my emotion? And I find myself imagining worlds in which, our grief altars and our ancestor altars are a major part of any space that we co-create with each other. Like, I love a collective imagination that also makes room to hear from our ancestors and to let them guide the spaces that we create. When we make rooms for Emergent Strategy and do immersions and other events, and we are like, okay, people, you can create an altar. The most incredible altars are always the ancestor altars, where people come and they're like, these are all the people who guide me, who hold me, who I grieve for, who I love, who I miss. And that energy coming into a room humanizes all of us, because it makes us all remember we're all going to die. None of us are going to live forever. The visions we hold, the ideas that we craft, that's what lives. That's what we have to do our best work at creating. That's what we have to pour ourselves into, because that's what will last, right? So I think I think grief is a crucial, crucial part of any vision we have for the future.
Well, and also thinking more about reimagining the world. How many visions can we actually manifest? And by that, what I mean is, if my orientation on life is different than your orientation of life, whose imagination should actually be, right? Like, kind of going back to your point about ancestors, I know people who are really devoted into Christianity, and they've told me before, like, don't do that. You're summoning in demons. I'm like, they're my ancestors. And they're like, no, they're dead. They're dead for a reason, right? So clearly that's like one point of view of life that's different, where they would feel maybe, I can't speak for them, but wouldn't agree with that type of way of life.
Yes. I mean, it's intriguing to me because I feel like the study of the Bible is scholarship of a set of ancestors who lived during a particular period of time, whose stories played out, and who we know are long gone, right? And, I grew up reading about Jonah, and being like, Jonah and that whale, Jonah is an ancestor, the whale is an ancestor. To me, I think some of it is like, What's the language you put on these different things, right?
Right.
But I also think there's something really interesting about, and this has always been my critique of Christianity, and a lot of organized religions, not just Christianity, is anytime there's structures that are designed to say, I will be the space between you and the divine, and I'll be the one who tells you how you can talk to the divine and how to be with the divine, I'm always suspect, right? Because what I have discovered in my life is that the place where I feel the most belonging and the place where I feel the most peace is when I'm in direct relationship to God. And I have met people in every single belief system who cultivate that direct relationship to God, whatever that looks like. And I trust spiritual leaders who encourage that, whether they're Christian leaders, Muslim leaders, whether Buddhist leaders, who are saying, have a direct relationship with the divine, however you understand it. If you listen, you will hear something, you will feel something, you will know something. And even the atheists and the agnostics in my life, I'm like, you still know that there's something larger than yourself that you can be related to, even if it's just the natural world. And I find that there's something universal in that directness, that I can feel this from within myself outward. And if I let myself be led by that, you can call it anything you want. If you let yourself be led by that larger than yourself energy, I think it does lead to belonging, and I think it does lead to a more collective vision of what the future looks like.
Wow. Sorry, I had to just take that all in for a moment. Sometimes I forget.
Yes.
So I'm like,
no, that's great.
In the middle of, of also hosting.
Well, that's how we know we're in a real conversation, which are the only ones we should have,
Yeah. We do have another question from Andy. Andy wants to know, what is the relationship between trauma and change, particularly around resistance and motivation to change?
Yeah. I love that. I think for a lot of us, trauma in our lives is one of the first experiences we have of change, right? It's like that we think everything's going well, and all of a sudden one of our parents is abusing us, or one of our parents or someone we know is causing us harm, or someone we love dies. And so suddenly this change comes in a very traumatic way, and it can shape us so that as we get older, we either want to only be the ones who are in charge of change, or we never want change to happen and we try to resist it because we assume that there will be trauma and loss that comes with it. Yeah. And one of the pieces of my life that I think has been super helpful in how I orient towards change is I've spent like the last decade plus in some kind of somatic learning process with somatic trainers and somatic therapists. And soma, right, it's the idea of the study of the body and its wholeness. And it has the generative somatics lineage that I have learned from. It has this understanding that we all have trauma. We live in a traumatizing world, right? So we might have trauma in the present moment. We might have trauma that is ancestral. When those of us who have enslaved ancestors go back and read texts of what happened to them, I feel it in my body. Like, I'm like, oh, that lives in my DNA. That trauma is there with them. And that trauma is there with me. So once you understand that trauma it's all around us, and some people experience it more directly and some people experience it indirectly, that's half the truth. The other half of the truth is that change is constant. Resisting change will not make change stop. And in fact, I have found that the more I resist change, the more traumatic the change is when it finally happens. So one of the things I've been doing is trying to go back and complete my traumas. And that's one of the ideas in somatics, that a lot of times something traumatic happens when we're a child. Like, say you get hit as a kid and you're told not to cry, not to have the actual full emotional reaction you need to have, right? And we've all heard this, like, I'll give you something to cry about. Don't you cry. You're supposed to be seen and not heard. There's so many things that we socialize our children to think that we have to truncate and stop our emotion. And all of those stopped emotions, they just live forever in our bodies until we go back and actually complete whatever that process is. And so a lot of my work for the past 10 years has been going back and just completing traumatic experiences and just relinquishing it. And now I can feel the clarity. It's not like it's healed. I have none of that, but it's no longer stagnant inside of me. I've like reopened the capacity for things to flow through me. So now when change comes, It's not like I'm like, yay, but I'm like, okay, change is coming. Change is here. I'm not going to stop the change. How do I partner with this and help shape it towards what I really want it to be? And I don't have to assume it's going to be a traumatic thing, especially and this ties to the last question. If I'm able to understand that like grief is a part of my life, suffering is a part of my life. Here it is. Right now I'm considering major changes in my life. And as I consider them, I'm like, oh, I will grieve this if I make this decision. But if I don't make this decision, I will grieve the absence of this opportunity in my life, right? Either way, there's going to be grief and suffering. And also, either way, there could be joy. Which joy is the one that I most want to align with in this moment? Which one is worth the cost of the grief that is definitely coming either way? Which one will I regret if I die and don't do? Right? So hopefully that helps, Andy.
No, that does. And that, I think for me, that reminds me. So my twin sister had a baby like 3 years ago, and she was in a lot of pain. It was a very experience. So afterwards, I asked her, and she told her daughter, I'm like, so was it worth it? And she's like, huh? I'm like, was it? I was scared.
Yes, you're like, I don't understand if it's worth all of that. That's right.
Yeah. And she was like, yes, it was. And it didn't hurt. Once she said that she stopped resisting the pain and focused on her daughter coming into this world, that it was worth the pain. It was worth the trauma. It was worth the moments of grief, because she did have a traumatic birthing experience. Yeah. And so probably in retrospect, that question was really ignorant of me to have asked her right after it. But
I think it's a really honest question to ask. And I mean, to me, it speaks to the beauty of your relationship that you felt you could ask something so honest that was true in you, and she could answer from her own truth. But, I've worked as a doula for many years, and it always astounds me to watch what birthing parents go through, and then how it all washes away when they see the one that they love, and how much harder it is if the birth doesn't complete in a life, right? Like when people have a miscarriage or a stillborn, or other situations, how it's like, even in those situations, it's like, well, I got to know this life. I got to hold this life even for a moment. There's something so sacred about it. So yeah, I love that question though. Is it worth it? Because not everyone feels it is, like there are definitely people who are like, this was not part of the calling of my life. And I appreciate that.
Yeah. We have another question. I'm loving getting all these questions right now.
Yeah.
Adrienne, I would love to hear about how your pleasure practice and embracing stillness for your writing practice, spiritual world, etc., has impacted the rest of your living.
I like that. I think the main thing is it's allowed me to understand that boundaries are an important part of how I need to move through every aspect of my life. That if I don't have boundaries in place that make sense for me, then I don't have any time for pleasure practice. I don't have any time for writing. I don't have any time for stillness. I don't have any time for taking care of myself. And my calling, like what I'm meant to do in the world, I believe that I figured this out for right now, is that I'm supposed to channel, I don't want to call it quite wisdom, but it's like channel something that the universe wants to send down, right? Because sometimes I'm like, oh yeah, that seems very wise. I understand that. And other times I'm like, I don't get it yet, but this is what came through. And like, I got to find a way to express it. And boundaries have been the thing that have allowed me to create that. My pleasure practice has been one of the guides of my boundaries. So now I feel very in touch with what makes me come alive and feel alive, and very in touch with things that make me feel like I can't feel my aliveness. Whatever's happening right now is actually detracting from my life force, my life energy. And that clarity, once you like, it's like a switch for me. It was like a switch that came on there. I was like, I have an entire system that is wired to tell me whether I'm enjoying this or not. And if I'm not enjoying this, I shouldn't waste any of my miraculous life energy on this. And that has been like a game changer for my writing practice. It's been a game changer for my love practices, for my spiritual work. I'll also say this piece, which is the boundaries that I hold with the external world mean that I don't have to hold the same level of boundary within my internal world, if that makes sense. So now almost everything in my life feels like part of my spiritual practice. Whereas before it was like, I've got to make time to sit on a mat. Like that's my spiritual practice. And now I'm like, everything is my spiritual practice. And when I'm writing, I'm in touch with spirit. When I'm loving, I'm in touch with spirit. When I'm doing my dishes, when I'm cooking, I'm like taking something that like miraculously grew from the ground and like figuring out a way to bring it into my body as nourishment. Like that's a spiritual practice. It's in the cycle of life. And so then it helps me attune to like when I'm choosing to engage with other people, can that also be a part of my spiritual practice? Can I be fully present with what the universe wants to send down and through that moment? So that's been a really major shift and I never want to release that. Now I want to keep growing into that more and more.
Do you get pleasure in all the work that you do? Because in your book, We Will Not Cancel Us, you talk about your unthinkable thoughts call out culture in the age of COVID-19 article. And you had in the beginning good feedback, and then you got a lot of pushback where you were doubting yourself. So is there pleasure in this work? Because it also feels like it's exhausting too.
That's great. I mean, I think there's not every moment is not, like this is an orgasmic moment of critique. I think that for me, the pleasure, like for instance, in that experience, the universe sent something through me very clearly. What I felt when I wrote the initial essay, I was like, there's some intervention and you are positioned to make it and you need to say it. And it's a risk. People will not necessarily want to hear this, but you need to do this. And I wrote it, I put it out in the world. I felt pleasure when I posted it initially. I felt very good. And I felt connection when people initially were coming back and being like, thank you for saying this. This is happening in my work, in my sector, in my world. And then when the critiques started to come in, what I had to work to do is like stay tethered. That I'm like, part of putting this out was not just so everybody would be like, you're right. Yes. But it was like, I'm asking a question. I'm saying that I think these are unthinkable thoughts, not because I'm like, secretly they're so thinkable. I'm like, no, I really think I'm not allowed to think this or say these things, but I'm really concerned about that. Like, I'm really concerned about there being things that cannot be examined in mature relationship, in mature movement. I want to make sure that I am helping to cultivate movements and cultivate organizations. And, the work that I have done has been facilitating organizations. I want to be facilitating and bringing to the table skills that help people to have very hard, controversial conversations around things that are actually not figured out yet. And I want to make sure that I'm helping people figure out, like, how do we deal with the fact that we're all embedded and socialized in a harmful world? Like, I wish that there was something where we just woke up one day and I was like, I'm liberated from harm. I will never cause anyone else harm ever again. I wish that was going to happen. But that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is we're all going to cause harm and we are going to learn to create an accountability culture. Now, the idea of an accountability culture, that gives me pleasure. The idea of a culture of good apologies, that gives me pleasure. The idea of a culture in which conflict is actually generative, that gives me pleasure. And I have not yet been inside of conflicts that felt good in the moment. Like when I'm having a disagreement, even with my partner, I'm just like, this is hard. But then on the other side, I'm always blown away. I'm like, oh my gosh, like we were so honest and look how much we learned about each other. And like our biodiversity is intact, because I think that's our job. We are of nature. So part of our work is like to be ourselves in relationship to others who are different than ourselves so that we end up with a biodiverse world. Those are the fecund realms in which ideas and life can flourish. And so I'm like, my part of being in a biodiverse world is learning how to fight fair, right? So it gives me pleasure when I'm on the other side of those things. Maybe that's part of my spiritual growth is to learn how to be in it and enjoying it, I do enjoy mediation. Like when other people are in a conflict and I can sit there and hold the space of deep breath and the space of both of their humanities, and just like, yes to all of the things, yes to the contradiction. Like, I find a lot of pleasure in those moments.
Do you then, since you're also biracial, so this is interesting, do you see yourself becoming more of like a mediator where you're going to start hosting like spaces between Blacks and white people and like,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think so, like explicitly in that realm. I do think there's people who do that work. My sister Autumn actually does that work incredibly, and is doing some really groundbreaking work writing on whiteness. You should have her come talk to y'all.
We would love to have Autumn.
Yeah, she's incredible. But yeah, I mean, what I'm interested in mediating is mostly within Black movement spaces, people who are having a hard time hearing each other within that movement space. Like, I'm much more interested in folks who are like, we are aligned and we share this background, and we even share this vision for Black liberation, and then we're having a hard time landing conflict, landing a disagreement, landing a misunderstanding. Those are my interested places. But again, in the Holding Change book, there's a whole section on kitchen table mediation, which is kind of how I approach it. And I would love for people to use that to do that kind of mediation, right? To me, I'm like, wherever you see that there needs to be a connection restored, or a boundary set, or an agreement made, I think that we all need to get good at being able to hold those moments. So I want to share, like, here's what I've learned in this sector that I think can help lots of other people. We'll see.
Well, I'm looking forward to that. So real quick, because Rachel, this is going in a different direction, but Rachel is one of our founders. We definitely got to take Rachel's question. She wants to know, what's God to you?
What is God to me? Change. It really is. I watch change processes happen, and I'll see them in people. I'll see them, especially in children, where I'll like look at a child and be like, look at God. Like, look at God. Like, this person, I was just talking to one of my best friends yesterday, and she had a kid like the year after we all came out of college, who's now 21 or 22. And she was talking about him, and I was like, no matter how old he gets, when you say his name, I see him in a diaper. And I'm like, look at God, like this person who we all circled around in a diaper and like took care of and fed and like figured out how this, how to take care of them as like a bunch of 20-year-olds. We didn't know what we were doing, but now he's the age that we were when we were all falling in love with him and taking care of him. And like, to me, just that cycle is part of the divine cycle. And to know that my parents see me that way, that like I come home to them as a 42-year-old, but they can remember holding me as an infant. I feel like change is like that in everything. Change is like that. So change.
That gave me chills. I know we are running out of time, and we are really grateful to have you here. Real quick, Alejandro wants to know, can you please speak more to how you imagine an accountability culture, post-cancel culture? And I really think that's a really important question, because you really go into this, which everyone, if you haven't already.
Yeah, I was going to say, I did say it. It's all in that book. No, but I mean, there's a lot in the book. I think the main things that I want to point to is that people read Mia Mingus's work and know how to give a good apology, that people read Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan's work and know how to engage in a community accountability process when it's needed, that people read Ajiris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Samarasinha's work and understand transformative justice, that we live in a world in which no one is disposable, and that community feels responsible for ending cycles of harm rather than feeling responsible for punishing people and shaming them publicly. I think we can get there. And I do have to run. My next thing is like starting right now, but I really, really appreciated this with you. Thank you for the way you showed up with me.
For being here. If we could put Adrienne's website, everyone, please make sure you go support Adrienne Maree Brown. We will not cancel us. This is a really great book. Emergent Strategy inspired this. Follow Adrienne Maree Brown on IG as well as Facebook. If you see right there, you can go buy Adrienne's book at akpress.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, love.
Bye. All right, powerful creators. What a show! What a show indeed. I'm really excited. I'm really pumped. I always get energized by doing interviews with everyone. So, as we close out today, I just want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for asking your intentional, thoughtful, challenging questions to really move the conversation and get the most out of this. And real quick, remember Inner Sense is a nonprofit, and we're always graciously accepting your donations, which make programming like what we just had possible, to be honest. If you head to our website at innersenthealingarts.org/donate, you can make a donation. We're also doing a fun community initiative that's going on right now to help increase funds for Isha so we can continue to have shows like this, as well as continue to do the healing artwork and movement work that Isha does. We are doing a community social media cleanse, and we'd love for you to join. The social media cleanse it's fun. It's a fun run for your mental health. We'll be taking 3 days off of social media together at the end of the month. You can learn more on how to join our sponsor by going to innersensehealingarts.org/social media cleanse. We are aiming to have 50 participants or more. Let's go for 100 to get more regularly involved with the Inner Sense community. Please follow us on YouTube. We have 10 right now who have signed up. So we at least need 40 more. So tell all of your networks, tell all of your friends to do this media cleanse with us. Let us get to about 50 and then let's get to 100. I think we can get to 100. I think that's kind of low. So I definitely think our community can get to 100. I want to thank you all for being here today. And lastly, you can access our live To get more regularly involved with Inner Sense, you can sign up for a monthly membership on our website. I've said that right there. It's, again, at the bottom of our screen. And you can get access to unlimited live virtual programming, including weekly yoga, meditation, astrology, dream work, tarot, Reiki, and more. So again, everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Janita Wiley, and we'll be back at another time. All right. Let's see if we can. Let's go for it. All right.